How are you doing? My name is Lars Christensen and I hope that you are ready for another Fusion 360 video. Today we're going to talk about the timeline in Fusion 360. We're going to talk about it on 3 different levels. We're going to talk about it as a beginner, as a professional, and as an expert. I'll let you pick what level you're on. Let's go. Alright, so as a beginner, I'm hoping that you have already noticed that there is a timeline down here by default inside of Fusion. And the way that timeline normally works is that if I go up here and create a sketch on a plane, you will see that we get that sketch icon there. If I select a circle and finish up that sketch and I extrude that out, then I will get the feature. And hopefully most of you have kind of gotten through this. This timeline down here is recording every single step that you're doing inside of Fusion. And you can always go back and you can right click one of these icons. You can edit the feature, or you can actually from right here also edit the profile sketch. That would be the same as right clicking the sketch here. One thing to know is you can actually also just move that little cursor back and forth. But this timeline doesn't actually have to be default, and some people choose not to. I would say I always have it on and it is the default, but be aware of that if we go up to your settings, so we click your name, go to preferences, and if you go ahead and go into the design space, there is in here an option to have the default, what is parametric modeling, but there is also a direct modeling, and I'll show you just in a second what that means. Or you can have the software to prompt you. So if you're jumping between different workspaces or between direct or parametric, you can actually have the software asking you what you want to do. The only time where the direct editing normally kind of appears to you is that if you go and you decide to open up a file of another format. So here I'm going to open up a step file, what is a neutral ISO format. And as I'm bringing this file in, so this file was created in another piece of software. Could be Inventor, could be SolidWorks, could be something else. But what you will see when I'm bringing it in, that it actually does not turn on the timeline down here. There is no timeline. And that is what we call direct editing. Now, the reason for that is that if you're bringing in some software or some part from another piece of software, this plastic part here, we need to create a plastic injection mold, for example, then we might need to do some edits to this part, and we can use the direct editing tools inside of Fusion and make some changes without have to record all those steps in the timeline. Mainly because the timeline down here can, as many of you maybe have noticed, can get a little long. So just to show you, in case you didn't know, if I go in here in direct editing mode, and I'm going to select the inner circle, I'm going to select the fillet on top, and there's also a fillet at the bottom. If I hold down Control and select those two and hit delete on my keyboard, then you will see that Fusion actually heal up that. It kind of takes the whole and says, all right, I'll delete the whole. Let me then glue everything up the way I want it to be. And this can happen when you're bringing in imported files and you want to make some corrections. So we could go in here and select these fillets. Around here. Select that one, that one, that one, that one, that one. Oops. And this is fairly, I would say, complex geometry. Somebody probably spent some time modeling that up. Let's go ahead and take the other side of it. That. All right, so now we selected all those different fillets. And again, if we hit delete on the keyboard, Fusion will go ahead and delete all those fillets. And it's not so much about what you delete. It's more about the surroundings? Can Fusion figure out to heal it up? But all these different changes that we just made, we might don't want those to be recorded in a timeline. That's why you do that in direct editing. So just so you understand, that's one of the powers of direct editing. Now, taking it a step further, now where we have a mold and a cavity, and you can see that the timeline down here have gotten some more features. This is actually done with surfacing. You have the surface toolbar up here. Be aware of that having this timeline can actually be a very good learning tool if you're new to Fusion. So you can grab this little cursor and you can move it back and forth. You can also use these buttons down here. So if I go all the way back to the beginning, we can actually click on next steps. And if I just turn this on, some of these things might be hidden. You can see here that this was the part that you just saw before. It was brought in. If I click on the next one here, then, and we hover over it, it would actually tell us that we scaled the model up, because if you're doing a mold, there's some shrinkage. Now I'm just going to grab the time bar here, and I'm just going to drag it out a little bit. You can see that there's some different surface bodies being created, and probably to plug some of these different holes in this body. You will also see that some sketches were created, and we can probably go in and turn those on. And you can see some different sketches was created in here that turned into some lofts and sweeps. And we can go ahead here, select all these. And you can kind of see those different surface bodies here. Then there was some trimming to do. So know that this timeline can be extremely well to kind of go back and look at what somebody did and try to figure out how the heck, what was the steps they took to do that. And then we ended up with kind of the core and the cavity done here. So as a beginner, that timeline running down there is super useful. Now, do be aware of, if we go back to our plastic part here, that you can turn that timeline on if you want to. All you have to do is going up and right-click up here, and you can say Capture Design History, and then it's on. And now anything we're creating from this point on will be recorded. And just as we can turn it on, we can also turn it off. So we can right-click here, and we can say Turn it off. Now be aware of, you get a warning that if you do that, these things will get lost. So if I said okay to that, then they are now gone. And if I turn it back on again, it just comes on as a base feature that doesn't have the sketches. I've literally lost those sketches right now. And I don't have to use some of the other direct editing tools to modify this part. Now, as a professional, I want to talk a little bit about what happens in this timeline when things start breaking. Because if you have modeled a few times in Fusion, there's a chance that you kind of start breaking things down in this timeline. And it's extremely important that you actually go back and fixing those. Now, I want to show you, it's actually pretty basic things that happens, but just some of the ways you can find out. So if I go ahead here on this end and I open up a sketch, and I'm just going to go ahead here and draw a square. And let's make it 50 by 50 millimeters, like that. And hit Q for press pull, and we can make a cut through there. So we have a sketch, and we have a feature. Now this sketch, if you're going to edit that, this sketch here, it's coincident to that corner, because that's what where I started my sketch, and to this face. And you should be aware of that in the background of a solid modeling tool, the software itself is just keeping track on points, edges, and faces, and they're all assigned with like IDs. So if any of those breaks, that's when you can run into problems. So if we put in our square, we extrude it all the way down the edge. But if I draw this one back, and I, for example, decided to open now another sketch here, and this is going to happen this sketch I'm creating right now is happening before those two other ones. And if I just cut this face away, let's go ahead here. I'm literally just cutting all this away. That means that I'm stealing that corner and that face ID. When I'm now moving forward, you will see that this, we still get the feature. So Fusion is powerful enough that it sees there's an issue. It's yellow. And if I right click on it and hit review warning, it would tell me that the sketch plane is lost. It's using its cache to actually be able to do this. And also there's a project source is lost, cache is used again. So it's doing two different things here. If we go in and we edit that sketch, you will see that everything looks somewhat normal, but of course that sketch is sitting where? That sketch is sitting out in space. It's having a warning. You should always go in and fixing these. And again, the idea is when Fusion is solving, it's solving from the first base feature. Every time it's recalculating, it's calculating every single steps. So you can imagine when it comes to this point that now it's using cache. Now it's trying to recalculate things. That's extra resources, no need to it. In this case, we could right click and we could say redefine the sketch plane, and we could select that face there and hit OK, and you will see that that fixed it. It went away. So all it needed was, it just needed to find that sketch plane. That's extremely important that you go and fix those. Another thing you might see is if I go ahead here and add a fillet here, let's add a fillet, something like this, to this part. This is all good. Well, I could create another sketch on the opposite corner. Let's make that 50 by 50. And just as I redefined our sketch to the right plane, I could go ahead here and say I want to edit that feature that was the original cut. And instead of selecting that sketch, if I could select that sketch right there instead, right? So let's go ahead here. Actually, there we go. It needs to be before that. So move that there. Edit that. We could select that square there. That's going to make that extrude satisfied, but it's not going to make that fillet satisfied because that fillet is looking at some place in here. Now, this one here gives us a red because it literally, there's no chance for it to display. Before, when the sketch was broken, it could still, Fusion could still solve it. But in this case here, it cannot. It's missing literally that area. And again, if you don't fix these, then that's going to be broken, and you will never remember where they were broken, right? So if we go ahead here and select this edge instead and give that some kind of a fillet, then the feature is now satisfied and is fixed. So as a professional, you definitely are not allowed to leave all kinds of yellow and red things down here. You need to solve these as you're working through them. All right, so for our experts, you always got to keep in mind that as you're adding more and more things into the timeline, the more the computer simply have to calculate. And that gives you a couple of different options. If you watch the video I did on the Rest Toolbox, I kind of talked about how I had modeled up the toolbox here, part of the toolbox, and then I started to lay things out with some different commands, the move command, the align tool, and then I added some different joints. And just remember that you can actually clean some of these things up. These two commands here, the move, the align, and the move, are actually kind of overwritten later on by these joints. So there is actually no sense of keeping these in here. They're really just they were moves I used to lay this thing out to get it kind of close to where I wanted it, and then I tied it down with these 4 joints. So you can go ahead and you can select these items, these 3 moves here, and you can actually, in our case here, we could actually delete them and get them out of the timeline, and that would save it up. Now, another thing I think is an expert moves when you're working with timelines is to utilize something like grouping things together that can help. So in this case here, there's a grouping here that was used for the layout for the mill. And if I just select those here and I just suppress them for a second, there was also some joints used here later on for the assembly. So this one kind of have 2 different type of configurations. And you could group these together. So if we select these and we right click, we can create a group, and that group we can rename so it gets a name. So this could be, as assembled. We could call that group that, and then we could go ahead. Let me just go ahead here and suppress that. Let's go ahead and take this other group here. We can right click, we can unsuppress it. And then we could create this into a group. And we could right click and we could rename that group to be manufactured. Now, manufactured. Now we have 2 different groups. We have grouped things together here. One is as assembled and one is as manufactured. And we could just right click. We can suppress that feature, and we can right click and we can unsuppress that feature and activate that. So that's just a way to kind of pack everything together. Now, the last tip I'm going to show you here as an expert, and this is a simple model, but I think it shows it very well, is when you start working with bigger assemblies, how can you possibly assure that you put as little down in the timeline as possible? And one of the ways you can do that is actually by placing your components or model your components where they're going to be in the final assembly. So you can look over here and you can see that this stool, and you can watch the video where I did it, is a bunch of linked components, which means that it's a bunch of different components being put together. Now, if we're looking at this footrest right here, what you see in the final assembly here, that footrest was, I think, one of the first components that was brought in here. Here you can see that it was brought in, and then there was used a joint to place that. So again, if I move back, you can see it's sitting there. If we move it down, then you can see that it's placed in place. Now, in this final assembly we're in right now, if I turn the origin on, you can see that that origin of this part is here. And this does take an expert to start thinking about this. But where you're placing that origin could be absolutely critical. And I'm not saying that this is a very good place for this stool. But what we could is, if we open up the footrest itself, and I turn that origin on, you will see that, well, like most people do, I modeled this one up right on the origin there. Well, if we go back into our assembly, and let's just go ahead here and delete it out of here. If I insert this footrest into this current design, where does it come in? Well, it comes in here, right? Now, we do get a free move in here, but at some point here, we will have to use a joint to lock it in, that maybe have to use 2 or 3 different connections. What we could do instead, let's just leave it out of here, was if we had thought ahead, we would model this part where it's going to be placed in the final assemblies. And this is the way that people have worked with CAD systems, going back to the late 90s, I think, where if you're putting a big assembly together, then you actually start thinking about these things ahead of time. So when you started to draw this one up, I'm just going to cheat here and use the move icon. If you started, well, actually, let's do something else here. Let's save as, just so I don't mess everything up here. All right. So when you start modeling something like this up, you would actually have in your sketches, you would have thought this through, and you would have modeled up this part here. I don't know, something like this. So you had kept that origin in relationships where it should be. So when if we go in now and we insert this new Lars version 2 in here, and is that updating? It actually comes in where we want it. And now instead of having to activate a joint, all it takes, as you probably have figured out, is to take this part and just ground it right here, and that will be a lot lighter than trying to use joints with different commands. So I hope that this is useful. I hope that you found this video helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If it was a completely waste of your time, if it was stupid, if it was dumb, give it that thumbs down. Leave me a comment. And don't forget that down in the description, there's a new way that you and I can connect via email. Until the next time, I hope you have an awesome, awesome day. Take care, folks.